Hello and welcome to Shopfix. My name is William Mandry, and in today's video I want to show you how I finished out this table saw stand project. It's pretty simple. I just used 1 1/4 inch by 1 1/4 inch pine boards to build out the frame, and I just made sure that my frame didn't interfere with any of the movement on the table saw, such as the rails that move in and out. So I just created grooves on the right hand side, and I routed on the MDF panel underneath here to make sure it slides back and forth, you know, full functionality there. I also wanted to make sure that my miter gauge could go back and forth, so I just simply routed out grooves for that, and that works out really nicely. Other than that, I didn't really have to modify the MDF panel all that much, and it is a solid piece. One solid piece, and I wanted to make sure I did that to just have a nice clean surface. I also assembled it and screwed it from the bottom up, so I have no screws to fill. It's nice and clean. It's awesome. I'm really excited. So I hope you guys enjoy this video and have fun building your table saw stand. After milling up some 2x4s, just as I did in part 1 of this video, I then ripped the boards a second time to 1 1/4 inch. Jointing these boards will allow me to also plane the boards to 1 1/4 inch thickness, resulting in nice even 1 1/4 inch by 1 1/4 inch pine boards to build out my top frame. By ripping 2x4s in half, I was able to build a nice sturdy top frame without using much material. By using a square and a clamp, I was able to create a stop block so that all my final crosscuts for these top frame boards were perfect. Then it was time to add 1 pocket hole on each side of the top frame boards. Using only 1 pocket hole enabled it to be flexible enough to move around while I leveled out the top MDF panel with the top of the table saw work surface. Then it was time to assemble it all together. This will be a good time to mention my method of leveling out the top MDF panel to the table saw work surface. I'm using these 4 legs on the outside of the top frame so that they'll land on the outside of the base frame. This will allow those legs to move freely up, down, and side to side so that I can level out the top frame to the top of the table saw work surface. These 4 legs, however, won't bear the weight. I will later add larger milled 2x4s to the bottom of the top frame. Using my drill press, I created an opening for my rack and pinion system on my Dewalt table saw so that the rails can move back and forth freely. To create enough room for the rack and pinion system on the Dewalt table saw, I also had to saw out the top frame and do that groove on my drill press, which is a huge opening, but it will be sturdy in the end. I cut the grooves for the rack and pinion system rather large because I didn't want a tight fit, I wanted some wiggle room. Flipping over my Dewalt table saw and putting it atop the MDF panel allowed me to mark and measure precisely the opening in which I needed to cut out of that MDF top panel. I also then lined up the rack and pinion system with the grooves that I had created prior and made sure that they were going to slide through perfectly. Then it was a simple marking and drawing out the square that I needed to cut. I wanted to ensure that the square that I was about to cut in the top MDF panel was perfect, so I used the straight edge to give a reference edge to my circular saw so that that can be accomplished. And again, using that reference edge to get that perfect straight circular saw cut. I had a bit of overhang on the MDF panel and I needed to sand that off because that's exactly where the legs are going to drop down onto the base frame. Now you can start seeing it come together with the 4 legs extending outward onto the base frame and some of the top frame all assembled around the table saw work surface. After test fitting the top frame that I just built, I knew it was time to mount the table saw stand to the base frame. It's important to note here that I'm still test fitting everything. The 4 legs that are supporting the whole structure are just clamped into place. Before everything is screwed in, I want to make sure that this is perfectly level. Not only does the Dewalt rack and pinion system extend out to the right, but it also extends out to the left, so I have to route a groove in this top MDF panel. Just like I did the previous grooves, I made these about 3 times the size that I needed to, just so that I didn't have to repeat this step, because it doesn't really matter, it's going to be underneath. With a straight edge, I began to level the top frame to the table saw work surface. Because the top frame and the top MDF panel extend 2 feet past the base structure, it's necessary to add some 45-degree supports. Unconventionally using 2 more pocket holes on these 45-degree angles, I was able to screw them into the top frame with ease. At this point, the top frame is all put together. With the grooves righted out for the rack and pinion system to extend left, it's time for its final test fit. Because the 4 legs on the outside of the top frame will not be enough to bear all of the weight, I have to add these 2x4s underneath. However, these 4 legs on the outside of the top frame have done their job to level the top MDF panel perfectly with the table saw work surface. Now, without further ado, let's get these 4 legs screwed into their final location. Well, there it is. The top frame is all complete. The supporting structures are holding up the weight, so it's time to screw in the top frame with the top MDF panel. However, we're going to screw this from the bottom up so there's no screw holes to fill. I clamped this thing down vigorously, so I wanted to make sure I get a nice tight fit for the MDF panel when I screw it all in. You can also see here that where the MDF overhangs, I needed to add a little bit more support just to make sure that it remains level. I wanted to ensure that the top MDF panel was securely attached to the top frame, but at the same time I didn't want to overkill it. So I drove in screws about every 8 to 10 inches along the bottom of the top frame. It's ideal when working with MDF to pre-drill your holes so that it prevents cracking and splitting as you screw in any hardware. Ripping the MDF side strip for the right side of my table saw stand top was the first cut I made on this table saw stand top, and it was beautiful. I then cross-cut the side strip to its final length. Securing the side strip with clamps, I then screwed it in from the bottom up. Not only does this side strip MDF panel give great support for the top frame, it also is aesthetically appealing because it covers up the pine underneath it. I also ripped this handy board to attach the sides to cover up the table saw from the side view and also to contain some of the dust. Using the drill press, I needed to match the grooves that I previously made in the pine frame. Using minimal material and hardware, this table saw stand is really starting to come together, and I love how clean the top panel looks. To wrap this project up, I needed to create grooves for my miter gauge. When making measurements to route out a groove for a miter gauge slot, make sure you really concentrate on getting the depth right, because for it to slide back and forth correctly, the depth has to be right. The width can be slightly off, and it will still slide back and forth as long as the depth is correct. With precise measurements and the use of this reference edge for my Dremel tool, I was able to route out a groove perfectly. After routing out front and back slots, it was time for a test fit. I was actually quite surprised on how smoothly it slid back and forth through the slots that I had created. After all that work, it was time for some finishing touches. If you didn't catch part 1 of this video, I also added 2 more milled 2x4s to the base structure, one on the middle front and one on the middle back to provide further stability. Since creating this table saw stand, I can tell you that it has opened my shop up to so many more possibilities. One such possibility was creating coves on the table saw for framing, and they came out beautifully. With the addition of this table saw stand, I can now rip large sheet goods and better yet assemble large projects on top of the work surface, which is 3 foot by 5 foot. Needless to say, this table saw stand will be vital on future projects.